Welcome to Virtual Machine Scale Sets. I'm Kevin Brown, and I'm going to walk you through this process. Before we jump into the configuration, I just want to briefly touch on what a virtual machine scale set is and why we would actually use it. If I have an application installed on the virtual machine, one of my concerns is that so many users connect to that virtual machine that it actually creates a bottleneck. The solution is to have multiple instances of the virtual machine available. The downside, you have to pay. So if I have 5 virtual machines that host my application, and if they're on all the time, then storage is going to be a concern because you're paying. All the resources that are used will have a cost directly associated with them. So with the virtual machine scale set, I can have one instance of a virtual machine. Based on demand, I can have that scale up another instance and another and another. For example, I could have one virtual machine with my web application installed. If the CPU goes above 75% for 10 minutes, I could have it scale up a second instance and I can have it automatically load balance those requests. Let's say 5 minutes later, it's above 75% on those 2 virtual machines, then I could have it scale up another instance and another. So this will simply keep scaling out, and scale out is what that term actually is. Just generating new instances based on whatever criteria we define. That could be disk, network, CPU usage. But let's say 5 minutes have now passed and CPU utilization has completely dropped. Now it's below 25%. Then we could have a scale in policy that says when CPU is below 25% for 5 minutes, whatever time we choose, I want to reduce by 1 instance. Then I want to wait another 5 minutes, and if it's still below that threshold of 25%, I want to scale in again. So you are only paying for resources that you use. So this is a cost-effective way to make sure you never run in a degraded state. You always have these new instances that can be spun up whenever demand is high. Then they scale in when demand is low, so you're not unnecessarily paying for virtual machine resources when you don't actually have a need for those resources. When I deploy this virtual machine scale set, it will also give me the option to create an Azure load balancer. That load balancer has a public IP address assigned to it. So let's say the public IP address for this is 20.1.1.57. I'll have my web URL resolved to that address. So anyone out on the internet that ultimately connects to our web application, they get connected to this IP address, which is the public IP address of the load balancer, and it then load balances traffic between how many ever instances we actually have. So those two things will work hand in hand, load balancer and the virtual machine scale set itself. We can also have this associated with managed disks. For logging, we can have storage accounts that will be the repository for any type of diagnostic logs. In this demo, what I'm going to walk through is setting up the virtual machine scale set itself and the load balancer. In the Azure portal, I'm going to go to search and I'm just going to type virtual machine, and virtual machine scale sets is going to be in that list that's returned. So we'll choose that. I'm going to create a new virtual machine scale set. I'm going to collapse this middle blade here so it's a little easier for us to see. On the Basics tab, I'm going to create a new resource group, and I'm just going to name it VMSS RG for resource group. For the virtual machine scale set name, I'm going to name it VMSS-web. For the region, now I want to create this in some availability zones. So the West US right now is showing none. No availability zones are available. I'm going to try East US. That does have some availability zones because I can select this now. And I'm going to choose zones 1, 2, and 3. The availability zones give me a level of high availability. I can have one virtual machine run in zone 1, the other virtual machine can run in zone 2. So if there's some type of failure in Azure in like a certain region, then my other virtual machine instance runs in a completely separate region and I would still have my virtual machine online, so we get a level of high availability. For orchestration, I can run uniform or flexible. Now, uniform says optimize for large-scale stateless workloads with identical instances. That's what I'm going to choose here. This means when it spins up a new instance, it's going to automatically be configured the same as all the previous instances. Flexible, I will manually start a new instance, and I can configure it however I want, so it can be slightly different. Now, with any of these configurations, if you hover over the information bubble, it's going to tell you exactly that. Flexible orchestration mode, you manually create and add virtual machines of any configuration to the scale set. Uniform, you define a virtual machine model. Azure will auto-generate identical instances based on that model. So that's what I want here, the uniform. Now, there are a lot of options as you scroll through all these here. Now, we're not going to go through every single option on every single tab, but if you do that on your own, just hover over the information bubbles, and they will give you a great description over exactly what it does and a link that'll carry you to the Microsoft Docs site for detailed information. For security type, we will choose Standard. That is considered basic security, and it's completely free. The other is Trusted Launch Virtual Machines. It just gives us added security, but it requires these Gen 2 virtual machines. And now Microsoft does support Gen 2 virtual machines for all the operating systems we would run. Server 2016, 2019, 2022, these Unix derivatives. But I'm going to leave it on Standard. Well, you'll see it defaulted to Ubuntu Server Gen 2. I'm going to change that to Windows. I'm going to take Windows Server 2019 Data Center Gen 2. I'm not going to use an Azure Spot instance. The Spot instance would use available resources in Azure with the caveat, if Microsoft needs those resources, they will automatically shut down your virtual machine. You cannot power it back on until Microsoft has deemed enough available resources in Azure, then you could start your virtual machine back up. That's just something you would do in a test dev environment to save on cost, because they are far less expensive to actually run, but you just know they could be powered off at any time. For the size, I'm going to leave that on the default, this standard DS1. And I'm going to set my credentials. Licensing, we're not interested in that right now. I'm going to click Next and go to Disks. I'm not making any changes to disks, but if you wanted to specify an encryption type, if you wanted to attach like a data disk, you could do those types of things here, but I'm not doing any of that. So now I'll click Next and go to Networking. On the networking, I don't have any resources created under this subscription yet. So this is going to automatically create a new virtual network for me. If I wanted to manually create the network, then I could just click Create a New Virtual Network, and I could do that myself. Now, you would do that if you wanted to define the address space, the subnet. If you knew you had to have a specific set of values for that, then you would just create your own virtual network. But for demo purposes, I'm not interested in that right now. Now, a few things I am interested in. The network interface here. If I click this pencil icon, I can edit the network interface. And this is where I can decide which port should be allowed. So I can allow port 80. So this is going to be a web server, we'll say. If I want to RDP into these machines, I could allow port 3389. I could also allow port 443. Whatever port you actually need. If this was a Linux or Unix-based OS, you would allow SSH, so you could have an SSH connection to the machine itself. Just whatever inbound port you want. If I want to enable the public IP address for the machine itself, I could do that as well, but I'm going to leave that disabled for now. And I'm just going to click OK. I'm going to click Load Balancer here. So this Use a Load Balancer. Now, what's interesting about this is I don't have to configure anything. This is automatically going to create an Azure Load Balancer. This is going to be the name of the load balancer, and it's going to create a new backend pool, which is the way a load balancer works. And all my instances for the virtual machines in my scale set, they just automatically get added to this backend pool. So at a minimum, there's truly nothing I have to configure related to load balancing other than select this Use a Load Balancer checkbox, and that is it. I'm going to click Next and go to Scaling. The initial instance count, I'm going to leave this on 2 right now. So when this is done, it's going to initially run 2 virtual machines. For the scaling, I can have this have a policy that's set manually or custom. Now, the difference between the two, if I choose custom, it's going to ask you a bunch of questions now about scaling out, scaling in. If you choose manual, you just have to come back and do this later. I'm going to come back and do this later. So right now, we're going to leave this on manual, and then we'll see that in the interface itself, because usually that's where you configure this or make any changes to it after the scale set's been created. We'll go next to management. There is not much I'm interested in here. The only thing we're concerned about is the upgrade mode. I can choose manual, automatic, or rolling. The reason this is interesting, many people see upgrade and they think of the operating system. This has nothing to do with the operating system. But let's say I make a new application available and I want to add it to my scale set. So you do that. You add a new application to your scale set. When you do that, should all the instances automatically upgrade themselves to have this new application or this updated version of an application? Or do you want to add it and then you manually decide which instances should be upgraded? I personally prefer manual because it gives me the ability to add a new application to the scale set, and we'll see exactly how to do that. And then I can say, I want to upgrade this one node. Make sure that node works okay. I say node, really we should say instance here. But then you could upgrade the next instance and the next, and you could just do that in whatever order you choose. Automatic, it automatically happens. So it won't all be at one time, but it'll be a randomized order, and it'll just automatically upgrade. Now, rolling will roll out in batches. So it'll do some of your instances, then it'll completely stop, then it'll do some other instances. Manual and automatic are the two common choices you actually see, and this can be changed at any time after the fact. But I'm going to leave it on manual for now. There are a few other options here, but we're not concerned with those, like monitoring, identity, logging in with Azure AD. But most of these will have these information bubbles, so if you want more details on those, you can just, in the interface, hover over any of those. But we don't need any of that defined. I'm going to go next to health. I'm not defining anything related to health. On the advanced tab, we're not defining anything here either. So we're really done. I'm going to click Review plus Create. That will run a quick validation. Then it will let us create our virtual machine scale set. So we've passed the validation. Now we will create. That deployment was successful. Now I could click Go to Resource, or if you've closed this window, I can just go back and search virtual machine, and you'll see virtual machine scale sets. That'll open the same place as if I had clicked Go to Resource. So this is my scale set. You will see right now I have 2 instances because that's what we selected. The initial instance count, we said 2. If I click on this, let's verify a few configuration settings. I can see I have my 2 instances and they both succeeded. I can see my location, East US, zones 1, 2, and 3. I can see the public IP address that's been assigned. I can see the size of the virtual machine. What I'm going to do now is copy this address to my clipboard here. And I'm going to open a new tab and I'm going to paste that address. This is what we expect to happen right now. This site can't be reached because there's no website at that URL. That'll be different in a moment. Now, back in the portal, I'm going to go to scaling. And we're on manual scale right now. That's what I selected when this was installed. I'm going to click on custom auto scale. It says scale on any schedule based on any metric. So if I scroll down a bit, this is going to be the setting name. That's my resource group. But if I keep going down, you'll see scale based on metric. There is an option to add a rule. So I'm going to click add rule. You'll see here it says metric name, CPU. Well, if I scroll down a bit, I can say the percent average CPU greater than 70%. Well, I'm going to say 75. So greater than 75% for 10 minutes. If that's the average, which is that grain statistic, so average 75% or higher for more than 10 minutes, I want to increase the count by 1. So the instance count would increase by 1. A new virtual machine would spin up. Now, what this does It has to be stable before it scales out again or before it scales in. So this cooldown here, 5 minutes, says once it scales out one time, it's going to let this run for 5 minutes, so it just stabilizes itself. After 5 minutes, if you are still greater than 75%, then it'll scale out again. It'll let this run for 5 minutes before it scales out again. The same is true if you scale in. It would scale in one instance, then it would wait 5 minutes, evaluate, scale in another. So that's the cooldown. But that's it. So I could simply click add, and we would be done. Now here it says the minimum instance is 2. Maximum says 2. I'm going to change that to 10. That would be it. I could simply click save and we would be done. Now, if I were to do that, well, I'm going to do that. And then as that's thinking, I'm going to click on my instances here. You'll see I have 2 instances. Now, I don't have an easy way to get both of these above 75% CPU. So to see this process just simply work, I'm going to go back to scaling, and we're going to set an unrealistically low number just to see it work. So back on scaling, I'm going to go back down to this rules. So that's where we had that average, the percentage CPU was greater than 75%. I'm going to click add rule, and I'm going to add another rule. Now this is not a rule that you would define in your environment, or at least not with these values. But instead of percentage CPU, I'm going to go to network in total. I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to say if this is greater than 1 for 10 minutes, whatever duration you believe is appropriate. You could define this to be 5 minutes, whatever is appropriate for your environment. Increase count by 1. Now, this is an unrealistic number because this is always going to be more than 1 byte of traffic simply being powered on. So I'm going to click add. And I'm going to click save. Now, if you do this on your own, just always make sure your maximum instance count is higher than the minimum. If I had left both of those at 2, then it wouldn't actually scale. If I go back to instances, it may be scaling already. Or if I refresh, you'll see I now have a 3rd instance. Initially, we only had 2 instances. Now we are up to 3, strictly based on that scale set. With that network in total, it's scaled out to include a 3rd instance. Now, what's interesting with some of these instances, if I click on the first one, Web 0, you'll see it's in Zone 1. If I go back to the scale set and click on another one, I click on Web 1 this time, it is in Zone 2. So there is not a single point of failure that would bring both of those instances down because they run in different zones in Azure. So we have achieved some level of high availability. Pretty fascinating. And you can manage some other settings here, like network settings, disks, just basic settings at the instance level. But if I go back to the virtual machine scale set itself, what I'm going to do is scroll down to extensions. And I'm going to make this a web server. For me to do that, we're going to do that through a script. So on this install an extension, I just type script, and there's a custom script extension. Now you could have also just scrolled down the page and you would have found it. But I'm going to click on that and choose next. Now the next part requires me to have a storage account. This subscription I'm using right now had absolutely nothing in it. So maybe in the real world, you already have a storage account. You already have an install script in it. But if you don't, you can create all of that at the same time. So what I'm going to do here, it says browse for your script file. Well, when I click browse, it says select a storage account. No storage account found. So I'm going to create a new storage account. And I'm going to name it RTS storage 0010. Now this name just has to be unique in Azure. So normally, like for demo purposes, pick a name and just put some like letters or numbers behind it. That's all I'm defining here. It's just the name, and I'll say okay. Now, this is actually going to be blob storage, is what it's actually going to be. And I need to create a container. So this will create a storage account. Then it's going to want me to create a container. Then we can put our PowerShell script in the container itself. That was successful. So this is the storage account I just created. When I select that, it's now saying choose a container. You don't have any containers yet, so click plus container to get started. When I do that, it wants me to give my container a name. I'm just going to name it RTS container. And I'll create. Now, if I click on the container, it will allow me to upload a file. I don't have a file yet. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go to Start and I'm going to search Notepad. In Notepad, I'm going to type a PowerShell command that will install IIS, which is Microsoft's Web Server Service, on our scale set. So I'm going to run this command, install-Windows feature web-server include management tools. Make sure I don't make any typos there. Install-Windows feature web-server include management tools. That all looks correct to me. So what I'm going to do is just go to File and Save As, and I'm going to save this to my desktop. I'm going to name it web.ps1. Now, this is Notepad, so it wants to save it as a text file. As you see here, it says txt. I'm going to wrap it in quotes, the web.ps1. Wrap that in quotes, and that simply overrides the txt extension or file type, and it's going to make this a PowerShell script. So I'm going to click Save, and now that's a PowerShell script. What I can do now is just go to Upload, and I'm going to browse. I'm going to choose my desktop and web. So that's the PowerShell script we just created, and we will simply upload it. Now I'll just choose that and select and create. That is already done. Anytime you go back to extensions here, you'll see the custom script extension show up in the list, so we know we've done it. But notice over here, it says automatic upgrade not supported. We are using manual upgrades because that's what I selected when I created the virtual machine scale set. I'm going to go back over to instances. I have my 3 instances, 0, 1, and 2. I'm going to select all of these instances. And I'm going to click upgrade. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to scroll over here. And you see this as latest model. What that actually means is the scale set itself has been modified, but the instance I'm looking at is not the latest model, meaning it simply has not been upgraded because we're not doing an automatic or rolling upgrade. If you were doing automatic or rolling, it still does not do all of these at one time, but this is how you would know which one has and which one has not yet been upgraded. But I'm going to select all 3 of those, and I'm just going to click upgrade. It says upgrade virtual machines. This action will manually upgrade the selected instance. While upgrading, instances may be restarted. So in the real world, you wouldn't do all 3 or all your instances that you have present at one time, but for demo purposes, just saves time. So I'm going to click yes. And I'm going to refresh. But you'll see it now says updating, running, and latest model, yes, since we've applied that update. Now, we're not going to see anything happen here other than after this is done updating, it's simply going to go back and it's just going to say that it's running. But if we go back to this web page that said this site can't be reached, now we'll have to refresh a few times because it does take a moment for that to install, but then it will have a website. That same IP address now connects us to IIS. So we know this is connecting to the public IP address of the load balancer we referenced. It is then being directed to the virtual machine instance on the back end. Pretty fascinating. If I go back to the scale set itself, You'll see all three of these have now went to a running state. Latest model, yes. If I make any other changes, I could do the same thing, and I simply upgrade when I want those changes to apply. If a new instance is spun up, it's automatically going to pull in those changes. So you would only do this for existing instances. If I wanted to change the upgrade policy, under my settings here, if I scroll down, there is upgrade policy. And you could simply change that from manual to automatic or rolling at any time. So easy to manage any of those settings that we defined when we created this at any time after the fact. Well, that's our fully functioning virtual machine scale set. So if you found this useful, be sure to subscribe to our channel and check out some of our courses on Udemy, which are all in the links below.